Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Patricia Huffman Smith NASA Museum, remembering Columbia. On this 22nd anniversary of the Space Shuttle Columbia tragedy, this commemoration, we're pleased to bring you a special night at the museum, something we hope to be able to do on a regular basis, some after-hours activities here. But to kick things off, we have a very special friend and a very special guest here this evening. As many of you know, Herb Baker, of course, had an incredible career at NASA, almost 50 years, covering not only the Apollo program, but all the way into the shuttle and space station programs, and now Artemis. And he recently published a memoir of that incredible career at NASA, and tonight is going to tell us a little bit about his new book, some of his fascinating experiences, connections, and memories, and let us know what's in store for America's space program. So ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome here this evening our special guest, our friend from the NASA Alumni League, Herb Baker.
Thanks, Lane. I appreciate that. It sounds like you all should be able to hear me, right? Okay. So let me start by saying it's an honor for me to be here. As you said, I'm on the board of directors of the NASA Alumni League, and we support the museum. And I personally was involved with Columbia. I never flew on Columbia or any other shuttle for that matter, but Columbia is special to me, as you'll hear later. And we just appreciate the museum and all that you do, so it's an honor for me again to be here. So a little bit of background. I was lucky enough to be living just a few miles from where they built the Manned Spacecraft Center, which is now the Johnson Space Center. And so I was 12 years old and in middle school when they opened the Manned Spacecraft Center, and all of a sudden the first two groups of astronauts, Grissom, Cooper, Carpenter, Schirra, and then the second group, Borman, Lovell, Anders, their families moved into my community. And so their kids that were my age were now my friends and classmates. And so, for example, I played on the junior high football team with Apollo 8 Commander Frank Borman's son, Fred, and with one of the original 7 astronauts, Scott Carpenter's son, Jay. And, Gus Grissom, who died in the Apollo 1 fire, I was friends in the band with one of his sons, Mark, and friend with his other son, Scott, and we're still friends today. And so anyway, as far back as I can remember almost, 12 years old, I've been involved with NASA. And then you mentioned Apollo. I wasn't working for NASA during Apollo. I was lucky enough to get a job. The TV networks to cover the Apollo lunar landings would bring down crews from New York, where they were headquartered, and they would set up a mobile home, a trailer on site at the Manned Spacecraft Center, and that was their studio. They would put a backdrop and have a desk and a camera, of course, and they would bring astronauts in to interview them, and flight directors and other NASA high rollers, and so back then there was no videotape or internet, and so when we filmed an interview, the TV network, you had to physically move the film from Houston to the headquarters in New York to broadcast it on TV. So being a local guy, they hired me to twice a day make the 100-mile round trip from the Manned Spacecraft Center to Houston Intercontinental Airport to drop that film off to be flown to New York so they could show it on TV. And so I did that. I was 17 years old for Apollo 11, working for ABC, and ended up working the Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 13 missions. I'd gone away to the University of Texas for Apollo 14, but then the timing, school worked out so that I was able to come back and also work Apollo 15 and a couple of the Skylab missions. So before I had even started officially working for NASA, I had been working on site there, and again involved with what was going on. And so then I graduated from college and started working at the Johnson. Well, it was by the time I started working, it was the Johnson Space Center. That was 1974, I think, when it changed the name, and I started in 1975. And one of my first jobs was working on the new spacesuits for the had spacesuits for the Apollo, of course, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program, but the shuttle was on its way, and so they wanted some new spacesuits for the space shuttle. So EMU, extravehicular mobility units, was the fancy NASA word for it, and so that was one of the first big contract I worked on. And a side story about that, being on the NASA Alumni League, there are guys in the NASA Alumni League who were there working at NASA during the Apollo program. And so one of them was one of my best friends now in the Alumni League, a guy named Joe Cosmo. He was a spacesuit guy. So I remember him from when, back 1976 or so, when I was working on that contract. He was one of the senior guys. He's probably about 10 years older than me. And so I remember, and so, fast forward now from 1976 to, 40 years later when I retired, and he's on the NASA Alumni League, and we became friends. And the story is, I was reading about him, and the story said, well, Joe Cosmo was, one of the leading guys for spacesuit development at NASA. When NASA asked him to come start working on the spacesuits, he didn't know anything about spacesuits, but neither did anyone else. Well, so literally Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, and he, was there for shuttle too. And so that was, it was really, really nice getting to kind of reconnect with him during, our Alumni League meetings. And so then after I had only been at NASA for about 4 years, when in 1979 they moved me to the shuttle orbiter procurement section. So I was working. By the way, if you didn't know, I was not an astronaut. I was not an engineer. I was not a scientist. I worked in the business procurement office, and so we awarded and managed the contracts NASA had with Rockwell and Boeing and Lockheed and Grumman, McDonnell Douglas, and all those other companies, some of which don't exist anymore or have been bought. And so in 1979, they moved me into the office that was buying the Space Shuttle orbiter vehicles. And of course, the first one, they had built Enterprise, which never flew in space. It was used for the approach and landing test. So I was there helping buy Columbia, along with the Atlantis and Discovery and all of the others too. So that was my first real connection with Columbia. And then again, I ended up being, years later, the contracting officer for the Space Shuttle operations contract that United Space Alliance had with NASA, and so involved with all of the orbiters and that contract. And then I was in that job in 2003 when the Columbia accident happened, and so I didn't have to testify in front of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, but I had to provide lots of information to them because, again, I was mainly responsible for administering that contract, and they wanted to know how United Space Alliance had performed because they were responsible for processing the orbiters, the whole vehicle. So I ended my, and I went back and forth between shuttle and station, and then Orion, and then flight operations. And I was working in flight operations, supporting flight operations when I retired in 2017. And that was mainly mission control operations and the Astronaut Office, astronaut training, flight operations, aircraft operations, I should say, at Ellington. And so I retired in 2017, but a lot of people ask me, I do a lot of speaking and podcasts and things, and people ask me often, what was the most fun or most interesting or most memorable thing about your career? And it's kind of hard to pick one, but what I usually say, I think my answer would be getting to work with and become friends with one of the Apollo 13 astronauts. So Fred Hayes, again, remember, I was 17 years old working for the news media during the Apollo 13 mission. So the oxygen tank exploded that evening, and I didn't go to bed that night, as did none of the other people working in the news media. And so I remember that very well. And so I had that in mind. And then I had my job, was working professionally at NASA in 76, 77 when he was flying the approach and landing test. And so you may know that was, they put the shuttle Enterprise on top of the 747 and just had it airborne and then would release it. And actually it was the Enterprise releasing the 747. It wasn't the 747 releasing the Enterprise. And just, practice landings just to get an idea for how the vehicle, operated and flew. And so, it wasn't like I was working with Fred Hayes at that point, but he and I were working at the same place, and I might see him occasionally. And so then fast forward to 1980, 10 years later, 1986, 87, and I was working in the space station program, and it's a long story, I won't bore you with the whole story, but they sent me to Kennedy Space Center for a year to work on what they called a source evaluation board. The space station program was in its early days, and they needed an integration contractor, engineering support, to make sure all of the pieces fit together. And they wanted a contract awarded, and so I was the contracting officer for this activity. And we there was a group of us from several different NASA centers that all went to the Kennedy Space Center, and we spent about a year there. Issuing a solicitation and getting proposals in and reviewing them and making the selection. And it turned out that Grumman won the competition. And you might know, so Fred Hayes, Apollo 13, he was the lunar module pilot, and Grumman had built the lunar modules. And so when he retired from NASA, he went to work for Grumman. So 1987, we selected Grumman for this new space station contract, and they appointed Fred as the new president of the Grumman Space Station Support Division. And so Fred and I negotiated the contract, the $1 billion 10-year contract to support the space station. And so he signed the contract for NASA, or for Grumman, and I signed it for NASA. And so that was, almost 40 years ago. And he and I have become good friends. He read my book because I have a chapter entirely devoted to him in the book, and I wanted to make sure I got I mentioned him throughout the book. So wanted to make sure that he was okay with what I was writing about him. And actually, he said, yeah, he just sent me a note about a week ago. Said you enjoyed your book. He said it was kind of nice. I recognized a lot of the people that you worked with that I worked with also. And he said, well, I think you hold the record for moving around between, transferring between offices, which might be true because I did that a lot. Shuttle station, Orion flight operations, JSC headquarters, JSC, KSC headquarters, JSC. And I never really asked for any of that. It was just kind of naturally happened. And another big part of it was, at JSC at least, my boss for most of that time there didn't like her managers to get too comfortable wherever they were working, right? So she liked to just every once in a while out of nowhere say, okay, we're all going to shuffle around now, and you're going to be managing this office instead of that one. And actually that was fine with me. Again, it kind of worked out well for me, and I enjoyed it. So I do want to, I have just a couple of stories. So my book, it's obviously not fiction, so there's no, plot, so to speak. I mean, I guess there's a little bit of a plot in my life, but but not a typical just lots and lots of different stories. So you can almost just open the book to any page and read for a page or two, and you're going to get a story or two. There are two of my favorite stories, and they're kind of short, but I thought I would read those to you just to give you an idea what's in the book. And so one of my favorites is about Dee O'Hara, and so she was the astronaut nurse. And so back when NASA was first started flying, Alan Shepard with the first American in space, and then John Glenn a little later was the first American to orbit the Earth, and Scott Carpenter and Gus Grissom and some of those other guys were also flying then. But Dee was the only nurse. The original Mercury 7 astronauts, for whatever reason, they liked her, and so they wouldn't allow any other nurse to take their blood pressure or give them shots or anything like that. And so she did that from like 1959 until the Apollo program ended in the early mid 70s. And so I met her several years ago and heard the story, and it's really kind of amazing to me. So from the book, I met Dee O'Hara at Space Fest 9. She tells a funny story about how she was chosen to become the nurse for the Mercury 7 astronauts. After graduating from high school, she wanted to become a nurse. She joined the Air Force and went to officers training at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. She was then sent to Patrick Air Force Base at Cape Canaveral, Florida in May 1959. She was working in the labor and delivery room at the hospital there when she received a message that the old man, meaning the commander of the hospital, wanted to see her the next day. She says, "I was terrified because I'd only been there 6 months, and I knew that when you went to see Colonel Knopf, it was for two reasons. One, you were in trouble, or two, it was for a promotion." Well, I knew it was not for a promotion because I'd only been there for 6 months. So I kept thinking, oh boy, what have I done? I didn't remember harming anybody or harming a baby. I gave morning report the next morning and went to his office. And here sat his executive officer, the chief nurse, and all these people. I really was terrified because I didn't know why exactly I was there. I literally sat on the edge of the seat. Anyway, he started talking about Mercury. And I thought, well, there's a planet Mercury, and there's mercury in a thermometer, and then he mentioned astronauts. That, of course, didn't mean anything to me. I didn't know what they were. He mentioned NASA, and I thought he was saying Nassau because of the island of Nassau. I had just been there, and I thought, how the heck did he know I was down there? Anyway, I was quite confused. He turned and said to me, "Well, do you want the job?" I kind of turned around because I didn't think he was talking to me. He said, "Well, you haven't heard a word I've said, have you?" I said, "No, sir." And he said, "Well, do you want the job or not?" I didn't know what else to say. So I said, "Well, I guess so." Absolutely not knowing at all what I had committed myself to. Of course, the chief nurse who was there was furious with me afterwards because she was losing me out of the hospital. Also, she thought NASA was crazy because they were going to be putting a man on top of a rocket. Anyway, that's how it started. So in January of 1960, I went out to Cape Canaveral, as it was known then, and set up the Aeromed Lab. It was the beginning, and that's how it happened. Wow. So, yeah, I can just picture her. Like, you talking to me? And so one of my other favorite stories, I got to know Alan Bean, Apollo 12. He was the fourth man to walk on the moon. Got to know his widow very well, and she tells a story about the Johnson Space Center has an astronaut memorial grove of trees. No one's buried there, but they have trees dedicated to every astronaut that has passed away. In fact, it started after the Challenger accident. George Abbey, who a legendary NASA figure who was the center director at the time, decided to set up this Astronaut Memorial Grove and dedicate trees to the 7 astronauts we lost in Challenger, and so it's continued since then. It's a pretty large grove now. And so there's a really funny story about the tree lighting. During the holidays, they put lights on the trees, and for years, all of the lights were white. And then there was a tree with red lights. And people, the Memorial Grove is inside the fence, so unless you have a badge at NASA or someone takes you on a tour there, you don't get to see it. And so people, and the grove is right next to the fence by the main road there, so you can drive by. And during the holidays, when the trees were lit, you could drive by and look over and see all of these trees with white lights, except the one with the red lights. And people would ask, why is there just one tree with red lights? And so I'll tell you the story here. Okay, so every December during the Christmas holiday season, JSC wraps lights around all of the trees in the Memorial Grove. All of the tree lights are white, except for those on 2 trees, Pete Conrad's and Alan Bean's. They were best of friends. They were the 2 of the Apollo 12 astronauts, and actually both also flew on the Skylab program. Until Bean's tree dedication in 2019, Pete Conrad's tree with red lights stood out as the only tree that wasn't decorated with white lights. That was done in honor of Conrad's famous quote, "If you can't be good, be colorful." Well, Pete was both, good and colorful. There's a great story behind the Conrad and Bean trees being the only trees wrapped in colored lights during the holidays. I've enjoyed getting to know Alan's widow, Leslie Bean, over the past few years. This story is best told by Leslie in her own words. So this is Leslie speaking now. The story of Alan Bean's talk at Pete Conrad's tree dedication and Alan's visit from Pete the night before the ceremony has become a bit of a NASA family legend. A few have even tried to claim that they were who did this, but it was and could only have been Alan Bean, Pete's teammate and best friend. This is how Pete's tree came to be the only tree in the Astronaut Memorial Grove at JSC in Houston that is lit in color during the holidays. I always smile to think back on that day. It was one of the great moments. Alan had a twinkle in his eye and a true Dick Gordon sparkle about him. Dick Gordon was the 3rd member of the Apollo 12 crew. When Alan told everyone at the tree dedication ceremony that Pete was there, communicating with him, instructing him on what to say, people didn't know what to think. They looked around at each other, initially stunned, maybe even a little worried. So Alan began, "Well, I sure wasn't expecting to see Pete last night, but he appeared at the foot of our bed, and he said to me, 'Hey, Al, it's me, Pete. I know you're going to be at my tree dedication tomorrow, and you're worried about what you're going to say, so let me tell you, when it comes your turn to talk, just stand there and hold on a few seconds. I'll tell you what to say. I've got some things to say to George Abbey.'" Now Alan stood very still and quietly looked up and to the left. People began looking around at each other, not sure yet what was going on or how to react. "Okay, Pete," Alan said. "I understand what you want. I'll tell George just like you said." Alan turned to George Abbey and said, "George, Pete says he was always the shortest guy in the office, and he doesn't want to have the shortest tree here." People were beginning to get into it now, and were smiling and nodding at each other, especially at Pete instructing George on what he wanted him to do. Alan looked over at Pete's tree, paused, looked up and said, "Pete, I'm looking at your tree right now, and it's the newest one, but it's not the smallest." Again, Alan paused and looked up to Pete. "Okay, Pete, I'll tell George that too." And people began to chuckle and to move forward to not miss anything. "George, Pete says for me to tell you to not give him a tree with those plain little white lights like everybody else's trees. Pete says, I was a little guy, and you know I always said, if you can't be good, be colorful, and you know I was colorful." Again, Alan looked up toward Pete, listening. What'd you say, Pete? You want me to tell George Abbey that too?" "Oh, okay, Pete, I'll tell him." Alan looked directly at George Abbey. Now George was laughing too. "George, Pete wants me to tell you he wants colorful lights on his tree. Pete wants lots of colorful lights on his tree. Pete wants to be sure you're going to do that. By now, people were really into it, looking between Alan and George and at the place above Alan where he was getting directions from Pete. There was much laughter, and George promised that Pete's tree would always stand out and be colorful. Pete's fun, colorful spirit was honored in the most delightful, creative, and loving way by his best friend. No one else could have done it that way. Alan could have done it the way Alan did that day. He had everyone participating in the fun. It was great. Everyone loved it. Everyone was having fun. The smiles and giggles continued throughout the ceremony. Pete's bright red tree is now one of the traditions during the holidays at JSC. Each Christmas until 2019, Pete's tree was the only one covered in color. In April 2019, at Alan's tree dedication ceremony, I told the story of that day from Pete's ceremony in 1999. Like Alan, asked George Abbey, I asked Mark Geyer, the current director of JSC, if there might be one more tree decked with color each year. As the astronaut artist who helped the world see the moon in vibrant blue, violet, pink, and red, Alan's tree will reflect his love of the moon and of color. They found the perfect spot for Alan's tree, not too far from Pete's. Actually, it's about the same distance apart as their respective graves are at Arlington. Thank you, George Abbey. Thank you, Mark Geyer. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Alan. I'll see you later, my love. That always chokes me up a little bit. And it is so Alan's tree is multicolored. It's got red, blue, green, yellow lights. It's beautiful. Yeah, and so I actually go out to the Memorial Grove every holiday season and take a picture. So I guess I'd like to tell one other story, and it's before I started working professionally at NASA. It was back when I was working for the TV networks covering the Apollo missions. And so I was working covering the Apollo 12 mission. And again, I mentioned that when we filmed an interview, had to move the film from Houston to New York. Well, at the end of the Apollo 12 mission, Pete Conrad was the commander and Alan Bean was the lunar module pilot, and they were the third and fourth men to walk on the moon. And when they were coming home, the local TV station wanted just a special local human interest story. It wasn't something that was going to go to New York and be broadcast on national TV. So they sent me and a cameraman to Pete Conrad's home, just a few miles from Johnson Space Center. And so I was there in Pete Conrad's living room with his family and the cameraman. As he was filming, the family watched Apollo 12 splash down into the Pacific Ocean at the end of Apollo 12. And so this was November of 1969, 55, almost, oh my gosh, 55 years ago. And I remember that day like it was yesterday, I swear. And so I remember when we finished filming the family watching the successful splashdown into the ocean at the end of the mission, the cameraman and I walked into the living room, and he put the camera in a black bag so that he could take the film out of the camera and put it into a canister and take it out of the bag, and he handed it to me so that it wasn't exposed to any light. And I got in my car and drove back to NASA, and there was a helicopter waiting for me. The news station was so anxious. This was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The news station was so anxious to have that film for the 5 o'clock news that they apparently didn't want to take a chance on me, I don't know, running out of gas, getting lost, having a flat tire, whatever, being in an accident, who knows. So they hired a helicopter to fly me, it's about 15 miles. And I still remember getting in that, I'm 17, I've never been in a helicopter, and I get in this little two-seater thing with all glass, and And the guy says, yeah, just got back from flying missions in Vietnam. You know, I'm thinking, oh man, I'm glad there's nobody going to be shooting at us here, you know. I'm just hanging on. He's flying down I-45, barely over the power lines, and there was no helipad there. I remember he had to find a place to park across, you know, like 4 or 6 lanes of traffic, and having to, you know, I had to wait a little bit to, you know, but it wasn't too dangerous to getting across the traffic. And I remember walking into that building, and there was a counter over to the right, and there was a woman who, she knew I was coming. She was waiting for me. And I remember handing her that canister of film, and I don't remember anything after that. It's like the adrenaline just went zoom. I don't even remember the helicopter ride back to my car. But I'm telling you, the whatever 2 hours before that, like I said, I remember it better than what I had for breakfast this morning. It's just amazing how 55 years can just be burned into your memory like that. Okay, so that's enough just to give you an idea of the many stories I've written about in the book, and so kind of why I wrote it. As hopefully you can tell, I've gotten to do a lot of cool, fun, and interesting things throughout my career and meet a lot of amazing people. And so for the last 10 or 12 years or so, I actually went back and looked, and on one of my Facebook pages from 12 years ago, one of my friends, I had posted some cool thing I'd been able to do, and they said, you know, you need to write a book. And I've been hearing that from, you know, many other people over the last 10 or 12 years. And at first I thought, yeah, right, sure, who's going to want to read a book, you know, by me? There's lots of books out there by astronauts and flight directors and all kinds of people like that. And I don't know the first thing about writing a book. You know, but as time went on and I thought about it more, and you know, I retired, and then the pandemic happened, and I had lots of free time, and I thought, you know, maybe I can do this after all. And so that's kind of a long story too. I ended up self-publishing because I wanted to have complete control over everything, you know, I said in my book and all the pictures I put in it and all those things, because actually Fred Hayes, I mentioned, he published a book. His book came out about 2 years ago, and it's called Never Panic Early, which is a great title, right? And he and I were chatting, you know, along the way, and he was becoming very frustrated because, you know, his big publishing house is in control of his book, and there were things he wanted to include in his book. And in fact, a picture that he and I are in that I put in my book that they wouldn't let him put in his book. So once his book was published, and, you know, we're having this conversation about how disappointed he was that he had things he wanted to put in the book that his publisher wouldn't let him. He had a website created, and so he put it all on the website, including the picture that he couldn't put in the book. And so anyway, that's I've got over 100 photos in my book, and rather than, although I did put a couple of pages of photos in the middle, like a lot of books do, I spread almost every other photo out, you know, so it's in context. You know, if I'm writing about it or telling a story about it, the picture is right there, because I thought, again, hey, I can do whatever I want, since no one can tell me what I can say or can't say, or how to say it, or what to put in or what not to put in. So far, I think, based on the feedback and reviews I've gotten, you know, most people kind of like it. In fact, I was telling somebody earlier this morning that one review that really hit me recently I got, it said my writing was charming. And I think that's good. I mean, but it's just, you know, I never dreamed that anybody would ever say that my writing was charming. Yeah, and I also said he also, at the end of the sentence, he said, and very detailed. And I've had a couple of people tell me that, wow, you know, you have a great memory. Well, it's not that good, because what I may not have mentioned is, you know, again, from back in the 69, 70, the early Apollo days, working for the news media, the public affairs office would put out just on a table, you know, flight plans and press kits and photos and mission commentaries and all for the news media. Just take it. And so I would go collect it for our ABC crew, mostly ABC. I also worked for NBC for a while, and I would also take a copy for myself too. So I have, for example, a vintage Apollo 11 flight plan from 1969 that I got Gene Kranz to autograph for me not long ago. And so I literally have a closet with about 5 or 6 Rubbermaid containers stacked about 5 feet high with documents and photos and, you name it, from all the way back to 1969. And so it made it, much easier for much of this. You might be surprised. Wow, you remembered the date and the name and the dollar amount and all those. Well, it was in my Rubbermaid container. So that made it a lot easier because that was funny too. At one point, I remember thinking, as I was writing the book, I thought, wow, those fiction writers have it easy. They can just make things up. And it doesn't matter, whether it doesn't happen. In fact, it's probably not going to be true. And I have to get it right, because I'm going to have space, experts reading this, and they're going to say, oh, no. And so I was extra careful. And again, I mentioned I asked Fred to read at least the parts of my book that I mentioned him in, and, got a thumbs up on that. So, yeah, but thank goodness I had saved all of those things. I think I knew at some point, even when I was 17 years old, that these things are going to be, worth something someday. So anyway, I will let it go at that. I would be happy to answer any questions anybody has about anything, whether I, covered it in the book or not. Anything about manned space flight, I don't. I mentioned to Lane earlier, having worked for NASA, a lot of people think I know all about the solar system and, dark holes and all that. No, it's pretty much for me been astronauts flying in space. Some of them to the moon, but mostly just in orbit around the Earth. Any questions?
So you spent time between Florida and Houston?
Well, yeah. So I temporarily moved to Florida, and that's funny because, well, it's funny to me because having grown up most of my life in Houston, huge metropolitan city, and arts and entertainment and sports teams, and so I knew I was only going to be there for a short period of time. Actually, I said a year. It was only about 9 or 10 months, actually. And I thought, and I was married at the time, and my wife kind of felt the same way. She said, I don't want to move to a beach town. Nothing against Cocoa Beach and Titusville and Melbourne and all those places, but she was not going to be happy just sitting out on the beach, with an hour drive to a big city. So we actually got an apartment just north of the airport there in Orlando, and I just took the beeline. Yeah, just got right on it, and it was about a 50-minute drive to KSC, and did it every day. The interesting thing about that was we were determined to finish in less than a year. Most source evaluation boards take about a year. Some take 2 or 3 years, but that's because there's a problem of some sort. And so there were nights when we were doing the technical evaluation of the proposals, we would work till 2 o'clock in the morning. And so that meant I would get home at about 3, and I would sleep for about 2 or 3 hours, and then get up at 7 to drive back, to be back at 8 o'clock. And we would have somebody go out, at 1 o'clock in the morning and get some food to, I think for some reason there was a calzone place, I remember, that was open, and they would go get calzones and bring us back something to eat at 1 o'clock in the morning to keep us going for another hour or so. But yeah, I did. So I got to spend a year at KFC. Actually, to be technically correct, we were in a secure facility, so we were on the Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. So I drove through KSC to get to the CCAFS.
Those long drives and late nights, you never wished, why didn't I get a beach house?
You know what? The answer is no, because I had only been married for a short time and we didn't have any kids. And so I was driving a 4-speed Mazda RX-7.
There you go.
And I loved driving that thing. So, you know, if I have to make an hour drive each way, you know, twice a day, that's fine. I loved my little 4-speed 2-seater RX-7. Yeah, sometimes I wish I still had a car like that. You know, had to go to a minivan at some point, but like most families.
Had they built the VAB while you were down there?
Oh yeah, the VAB was there. Yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah,
Massive structure.
yeah. You know, sometimes it has its own atmosphere. I mean,
It had air conditioners and heaters at the top, because it was rain or
Yep.
fog.
yep. That's a huge building. Yeah, it's been there a while. Yeah, and still there, of course.
Now that you're an outsider, so to speak, what excites you the most about NASA and the direction it's going today?
Well, I didn't mention it because most people don't remember it or know about it, but for a while we had a constellation program. I think it was I can't remember which president it was now. And so we're going back to the moon. And this was about 2006 or so. And so we had already started, we had an office set up to a project management office to design the next lunar lander. And I was working, supporting that office. And, you know, so I, going to meetings and thinking about, again, not being an engineer or technical, but, supporting what they were doing to design the next lunar lander. And so my hopes were really, high. I mean, God, now this is 18 years ago of going back to the moon. And I remember, being really excited because, again, I was there for, the first time we did it. And then the program was canceled. And actually, it was canceled, but Orion survived. We didn't have a lunar lander, but to replace the Apollo lunar or the Apollo command module, we were building Orion. Orion is been described as Apollo on steroids. So the Apollo command module could hold 3 astronauts. Artemis can hold 4. So it's about 1.5 times as large. But so it survived. I mean, the lunar lander didn't survive, but the rocket, it was called something else then, but there's now the Space Launch System, so it kind of survived too. So I've just ever since then I've been wishing and hoping. Wow, I'm going to go back to the moon. I want to go back to the moon, and finally, it looks like maybe. Of course, it's still late next year before the next Artemis launch is currently scheduled, and I'm suspecting, like most, it'll be, delayed again for either, budget issues or technical issues or something. So I hope I'm still around the next time we go back to the moon. But that's what I'm looking. There's talk about going back to Mars, but there are so many things we still haven't figured out. Radiation is just one of them. It's one thing to go spend 3 days going to the moon. It's something entirely different to spend 6 months going to Mars. What are you going to eat? All kinds of things like that they still haven't figured out yet. So, I hear people talking about, well, no, we're going back this decade or whatever. Yeah, I don't believe that for a minute. I'd love to see it, if we had the capability and technology to do it, but based on my experience, there's no way I can see us getting to Mars in the next 20 years even. I mean, I think back, one of the things I got to work on was, and I'm not going to say anything about politics, but Elon Musk, this is 2006, and we had, we were going to stop flying the space shuttle, and we wanted private industry, commercial companies to start becoming more involved in space, and they have, including SpaceX. But so I was involved in what they called the COTS, COTS, Commercial Orbital Transportation Services. And so what NASA decided to do was make $500 million available as seed money to private companies to encourage them, motivate them to build their own space vehicles. And we told them, you can build it however you want. All we want you're going to be like a taxi for us. We just want you to be able to take our astronauts safely from Earth to the space station and back. That's it. That's all. We're going to be looking over your shoulder to make sure you're not again doing anything that could harm one of our astronauts. But otherwise, it can look any way you want. I mean, there's one company, Sierra Nevada, that does even kind of a mini space shuttle looking thing, and the SpaceX Dragon doesn't look that much like Boeing's Starliner, but I was involved in the COTS reviewing the proposals, and I still have a copy of the contract that Elon Musk signed with NASA in 2006 to give them, we actually gave it to them in increments because they had to meet milestones along the way, to give them about $200 million, which got them on the road to building what they have today at SpaceX. And so anyway, my point of all that was 2006. And so we're, 19 years later, and they've been flying for a couple of years, but, getting from the Earth to the space station is a lot different from getting to the Earth to Mars. So, and that, again, 19 years. Anything,
Do you still miss it?
do I miss it?
Do you still miss it?
I miss the people more than the work. I love the work, but I mentioned I'm on the board of directors of the NASA Alumni League, and so we're still involved. I mean, I'm not employed by NASA, and I don't go to work every day, but we hold our board meetings on site every month, and I have a badge as part of the Alumni League that 24/7 I can come and go on NASA just like any other employee. And so I'm on site at NASA about once a week. I still have a lot of friends there, and we're still involved, with things going on. And we're gonna have a book signing. Some of us in Alumni League that have written books on site at NASA in the cafeteria in March, and so I'm still involved enough, and know what's going on and being around that I don't miss the work nearly as much as I miss the people. But even then, again, I can when I'm on site, I not too hard to go walk into a building and say hi to somebody I worked with. But they're a lot. Well, so it's been 8 years now, 8 years and a month since I retired. So there's a lot of other people that have moved on, and now even more moving on.
A lot of new faces.
Yeah, I probably only know in 8 years the turnover. I probably know only about half of the people that are there now working of the 120, 130 people in the organization I worked in. I probably only know half of them. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
How long did it take you to write your book?
Oh, well, it's kind of hard to say because I did it, again, kind of in increments. It total probably about a year and a half, but there were a couple of times in there where I took like a couple of months off, and even after I finished writing it, I kept revising it for a while. I mean, I got, you know, I was telling, I think it was you or maybe it was somebody else I was telling, after I finished my manuscript, my draft, which I still had to, you know, proofread and edit and things, I ended up with draft number 12. I mean, obviously it wasn't a total rewrite, but I would go back and read through it and, oh, why did I say it like that? Or, oh, there's a typo, or, you know, a punctuation, or you know, misspelling, or, I mean, that's mostly proofreading stuff, but, you know, I was, oh, you know, I forgot about this conversation, or you know, and as part of the Alumni League, I'm still doing things like this that, you know, are possibly worth writing about. And so it was really hard to get to the end. And even then, I just didn't, I had a hard time stopping, because even after I got to draft number 12, and I thought, I'm not going to do any more drafts, but I was about ready to publish it, and I thought, oh, I got to go one more time. And so I went through it, and instead of calling it draft 13, I called it final. Well, I had a final, and then one more time. But instead of final, I just took all of the finals and drafts off, and so it was just the name of the book. So I knew that was the end of it. And yeah, so yeah, it was my first and only book so far. But it was, yeah, you know, it was actually, I enjoyed it much more than I thought, even though I, again, feeling like, you know, well, gosh, I have to, you know, those fiction writers can do whatever they want. I have to get this right. You know, it was kind of fun reliving some of those things from, I mean, literally 50 years before, and looking back through some of those documents and pictures and photos and stuff that I hadn't looked at in a long time. So.
And one other question. What are going to happen to the tubs of information that you have stacked? What's your plan?
That's a great question, and I don't know, because actually someone else, there's a guy in New York who has his home's like a museum. I mean, he's been collecting things for years, and he's got, I mean, much of it is, you know, autographed, you know, astronaut autographs, pictures and books and things. But we actually have, part of the Alumni League is a historical preservation activity we have at the University of Houston. And so we have an archive, and they're constantly, you know, people who retired from NASA or still retiring from NASA, and they have an attic full of books and manuals and notes and, you know, notebooks and things. They dedicate, you know, donate them, I should say, to our archives, and we go through and catalog them and, you know, copy them and things like that. And so it came up, this guy in New York contacted me, I think it was somehow saw my book, and because I don't know him otherwise, I've never been to his house. And he said, hey, I've got all of this stuff, and I don't know, you know, I live alone, and I don't have a, you know, a family, and what am I going to do with it? And I said, well, let me check on our archives. And they said, no, we don't want that. That's not, you know, I mean, it's kind of cool, and it's probably even worth some money, you know, autographed photos and books and things by astronauts, but there's no historical value in it, really, you know, as compared to a notebook of your calculations that you made on, you know, for somebody going to the moon or orbit, you know, around Earth, or you know, something like, or you designed some kind of piece of equipment, and so they, you know, I mean, I have some of both, actually, but unfortunately, although, you know, I don't blame them. I have two sons. They're both grown. They're 31 and 34, and they never really got interested in space.
My kids are the same way.
In fact, it's funny, kind of a funny story. So, I mean, I've worked, you know, basically my whole life at NASA, and so I'm married and two kids, and my kids were both in college. And my older son at MIT, and he met his girlfriend there, and she ended up getting a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics. But as she was working on that, and she lives not far from us actually, which I think is why she and my son got together. She lives in Sugar Land, and we're just south of Houston. And so, being working on a PhD in aeronautics and astronautics, she said, Mr. Baker, would you take me on a tour of NASA? I said, I would love to, and I'll see if my family wants to maybe tag along this time, because they've never once in the entire time I've worked there and that we've lived there, did they ever ask to go, have them taken on a tour of NASA. And so it was actually kind of cool because we were in the space vehicle mock-up facility. They're building 9. I don't know how much you know about it. And I did a lot of tours there. So that was kind of cool. With my history and background and knowledge of so much and supporting flight operations, even for NASA employees at the Johnson Space Center, not every employee has access to every area. Mission control, you can't get in there. You have to have it coded on your badge to get into mission control, unless you work there, and then your badge is coded. Same thing with Building 9, the Space Vehicle Mock-up Facility, and with the Neutral Buoyancy Lab. Unless you work there, you can't just walk in even as a NASA employee. And so they coded my badge so I could go anywhere I wanted, because they would even ask me if sometimes an author came into town, and one time a bunch of folks from NASA headquarters came into town, and they asked me to lead the tours. In fact, even after I retired once, some folks from different NASA centers were coming into Houston to be at JFC, and a woman in HR called me and said, hey, we've got some folks coming in. Would you mind doing a guided tour? And I said, I'm retired, right? And she said, yeah, we'll take care of that, because I had to give my coded badge up when I retired. And so anyway, we're in the Space Vehicle Mock-up Facility, and Katie Coleman was in there, and we got to say hi to Katie. It was kind of cool because Katie lives in Massachusetts. Well, she did, and I guess she does now. She's retired. And so she had come to speak at MIT, and so my future and now current daughter-in-law had met her there, and so it was really cool for them to be together there. But yeah, I love my sons. I wouldn't trade them for anybody, and they're both having great lives and great careers. But they really never cared that much about NASA or space. So, I'll obviously leave it to them, I guess, at this point, and let them decide what to do with it. I won't care. I guess I keep telling myself that. So.
I'm going to intervene here. Herb will be back tomorrow morning, very, 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 very early.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to take the liberty and cut you all off.
Okay. Yay.